The biggest World Cup in history has been dominating headlines for months. And yet, there are cities that were supposed to be the center of the world right now. Cities sitting with half-empty hotels, unsold tickets, and sponsors staring at spreadsheets with visible concern. That's happening. It's real. Nobody is making that up. But there's another side to this story, the one that, honestly, I find a lot more interesting. Because while some American host cities are struggling to fill their stadiums, there's a place where people have spent months unable to get a single ticket. A place where hotel rates have climbed 50% and are still climbing. A place where, on June 11th, 83,000 people are going to make a noise that Pele once said you have to be inside to understand. He didn't describe it with statistics. He didn't reach for numbers or projections or economic impact assessments. He described it as something that has no equivalent anywhere else on Earth. Something felt in the chest, something that bypasses language entirely. That place is the Azteca. And what's happening there, and in Vancouver and Toronto, is the exact opposite of what's going on in many of the American venues. This World Cup isn't one tournament. It's 3 separate tournaments happening simultaneously under the same name. And the difference between them has nothing to do with stadiums or budgets. It has to do with something far harder to build and far easier to lose. Real soccer culture. The kind that can't be improvised with a marketing campaign or a $4 billion stadium. The kind that either exists in a city or it doesn't. Full stop. When FIFA selected the joint bid from the United States, Canada, and Mexico, back in 2018, the promise was the ultimate spectacle. 48 national teams, 16 host cities, 3 countries, the most ambitious tournament ever designed. What nobody fully calculated, or maybe nobody wanted to calculate, is that those 3 countries don't experience soccer the same way. The gap between how each of them relates to this sport was always going to become the real story of the tournament. And that story, with the opening match nearly upon us, is already written in the data with a clarity that's hard to ignore. That's what this is about. The numbers nobody is putting together, the cities that are working and the ones that aren't, and what all of that says about what soccer actually is and who it really exists for when it gets organized at this scale. But there's something else the numbers don't quite capture. There's a type of visitor showing up in Mexico City, Guadalajara, and Monterrey that doesn't fit the typical World Cup tourist profile at all. They're not flying in for 3 days, watching a match, and heading back to the airport. They're coming for weeks, renting an apartment, working remotely, organizing their entire lives around the match schedule. Europeans, South Americans, people who've done the math and figured out that if you're going to spend the money on flights and tickets anyway, it makes more sense to plant yourself in a city with the best food on the continent, a cultural scene that never stops, and a soccer atmosphere that can't be manufactured from scratch. They're choosing immersion over convenience. And the cities they're choosing say a lot. That kind of visit has a different economic impact than conventional tourism. It's more distributed, more sustained. It benefits neighborhoods, local markets, family-owned restaurants, street vendors, not just the big downtown hotels. It's, perhaps without anyone planning it that way, an interesting model for thinking about how major international events can integrate into cities in a more organic, more lasting way. The money doesn't just flow into one zip code and disappear. It spreads. Guadalajara has 4 matches on the schedule, and a city that has been waiting for this moment for years. Monterrey, with the BBVA Stadium set against the Sierra Madre in the background, has one of the best soccer atmospheres in all of Latin America. 13 matches in Mexico in total. 13 times that country is going to demonstrate what it has known for decades, that soccer isn't an entertainment product you consume. It's something that belongs to a collective identity. That's not something you learn in 4 years of preparation. Either you have it or you don't. It's worth pausing on Monterrey specifically because it's the host city getting the least attention and the one that perhaps best illustrates everything we're talking about. The BBVA Stadium isn't the Azteca. It doesn't carry the Azteca's mythology or its historical weight, but it has something that can't be improvised either. A fan base that has spent decades turning that stadium into one of the most intimidating venues on the continent for any visiting opponent. The atmosphere at BBVA during a big Rayados match isn't manufactured. It's earned slowly over generations of people making that stadium the center of their Sundays. The Rayados and Chivas are not just soccer clubs in their respective cities. They are institutions that structure the social lives of millions of people. That distinction matters. A sports franchise generates revenue. An institution generates identity. There's one detail that captures all of this better than any statistic. The wave, that collective motion that rolls through the stands of stadiums all over the world, was invented at the Azteca. In the 1980s, among the crowds that packed those stands during the 1986 World Cup, it wasn't the idea of an entertainment director. It wasn't a corporate initiative or an officially sanctioned crowd management technique. It emerged spontaneously from a mass of people who had been together in that place long enough to develop their own shared language. Nobody announced it. Nobody coordinated it. It just started, because that's what happens when a crowd is that connected to what it's watching. That's what Mexico brings to 2026. When those fans welcome national teams from around the world in their own stadium, they're not going to behave like neutral spectators who bought a ticket to watch a show. They're going to behave like what they are, people who have spent their entire lives in those stands and know exactly how this is supposed to feel. Players notice that. Referees notice it. Coaches talk about it in pre-match press conferences, usually by saying something careful and professional, when what they mean is that they're a little scared. And television cameras from around the world are going to notice it too. Even if it's hard to put a name to, something as difficult to define as the difference between a stadium that's full and a stadium that's alive. That said, it's worth acknowledging something that often gets glossed over in this kind of analysis. Mexico didn't arrive at 2026 without its own challenges. The renovation of the Azteca ran significantly longer than planned. There were real moments of uncertainty about whether the stadium would be ready in time for the opening match. The internal logistics of a country hosting 13 matches across 3 cities separated by hundreds of miles is not a trivial operation. What sets Mexico apart isn't that everything went smoothly. It's that when something went wrong, the culture surrounding soccer acted as a shock absorber. Fans don't wait for the experience to be flawless before committing to it. They show up for the match, and when it arrives, they celebrate with an intensity that has nothing to do with whether the stadium entrances ran efficiently or whether the official app crashed during group stage. There's something almost freeing about that. And it's something the organizers of major events should probably study more carefully than they usually do. Now, Canada. The Canadian story is different, and in some ways even more significant, because it doesn't arrive carrying decades of soccer tradition. Canada doesn't have the accumulated memory of the Azteca or the generations of fans who have lived this sport like a secular religion. What Canada has in 2026 is something else entirely. This is the first time in history that a men's World Cup has been played on Canadian soil. The first time. For a country that has been building a soccer culture from the ground up over the past decade, that carries an emotional weight that's hard to quantify but very easy to feel. Hotel reservations in Canadian host cities have climbed 173% compared to the same period last year. Not 173% more than some American cities. 173% in absolute terms, year over year. The province of British Columbia is expecting around 350,000 visitors coming specifically to Vancouver for the tournament. Deloitte's estimates for the Greater Vancouver metropolitan area project more than 1 million visitor nights tied to the World Cup. Compare that to New York, which is now tracking roughly $100 million less in hotel revenue than originally anticipated. The contrast isn't subtle. It isn't even close. Why has Canada worked? You have to be honest here and acknowledge that part of the answer is fairly straightforward. Entry into Canada for most international fans is simple. The electronic travel authorization takes minutes online, costs $7 and doesn't involve the financial documentation requirements or the underlying uncertainties that have complicated travel to the United States for citizens of many countries. Under the current political and immigration climate in America, international fans have increasingly found the visa process difficult to navigate, with some reports indicating that bond requirements and heightened border scrutiny have discouraged travelers from dozens of countries. The U.S. government has said it will relax some of those visa bond rules for World Cup attendees, but the damage to planning timelines was already done for many fans. This isn't a political judgment on American immigration policy. It's simply an acknowledgement that when logistics get complicated, people adjust their plans, and in 2026, Adjusting plans has meant, for a lot of international fans, choosing Toronto or Vancouver instead of Dallas or Kansas City. But Canada has something beyond accessible paperwork. Toronto is, by most meaningful measures, the most culturally diverse city in the world. More than 50% of its residents were born outside Canada. When the World Cup arrives in Toronto, fans from Bosnia, Portugal, South Korea, Senegal, they don't necessarily need to fly in from their home countries. Many of them already live there. The city doesn't need to import the world in order to give the World Cup an atmosphere. The world is already installed in its neighborhoods, in its restaurants, in its soccer leagues, in the arguments people have over coffee about last weekend's results. That is an advantage no city can manufacture in 4 years of tournament preparation. Either it's what you are or it isn't. Vancouver operates on a different logic, but one that's equally solid. BC Place sits in the heart of downtown, with mountains as a backdrop and the Pacific Ocean close by. Its geographic position makes it the natural entry point for fans coming from Japan, South Korea, Australia, and across the Pacific region. The western cluster of the tournament connects Vancouver with Seattle, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, which means someone arriving in Canada can take in multiple matches without having to clear U.S. entry requirements if they'd rather not deal with it. That logistical flexibility has had a real and measurable impact on booking decisions. Fans who wanted a multi-match trip and found the American side logistically intimidating have had a clear alternative. There's another element in the Canadian story that deserves more attention than it usually gets: the role the national team itself has played in all of this. Canada qualified for the Qatar 2022 World Cup for the first time in 36 years. The sporting result was modest. They went out in the group stage without a win, but something shifted in how soccer is perceived domestically. Alphonso Davies was already a global superstar before Qatar, Champions League winner, Bundesliga title holder, one of the best left-backs on the planet. But the World Cup turned the national team into a collective project that an entire generation of Canadians identified with in a way that had simply never happened before. They watched their team on the biggest stage in the world, and they wanted more. That emotional capital, built up between 2022 and 2026, is part of what explains why the bookings aren't coming only from international tourists. There is genuine domestic demand, Canadians who want to watch their team on home soil for the first time in history. That kind of fuel doesn't come from a marketing campaign. You can't buy it, and you can't schedule it into existence. It accumulates over years of results, of heartbreak, of finally making it through qualification, of watching a kid from Edmonton become one of the best players on earth and think, for the first time, that this is actually our sport too. Canadian soccer isn't a century-old tradition, but in these 4 years, it has managed something that might be worth even more. It has become something people feel is genuinely theirs. And in terms of attendance and atmosphere, that is worth as much as any number of decades of accumulated history. And then there's the American side of the tournament, where the story is considerably more complicated. There are host cities where 80% of hotels are reporting bookings below a normal summer. There are tickets that have been sitting on the resale market for weeks at prices no one is buying. There are cities that expected a transformative tourism impact and are, for the moment, staring at their numbers with real concern. According to the American Hotel and Lodging Association, FIFA made massive advance room reservations across all American host cities, and then canceled as much as 70% of those reservations in cities including Boston, Dallas, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and Seattle. The association says this created artificial demand that misled hotels into overstaffing and overprojecting their revenue. FIFA denied those claims, saying all room releases followed contractually agreed timelines. But regardless of how you assign responsibility, the result is the same. Hotels in major American cities are sitting on inventory they expected to sell months ago and haven't. In Philadelphia, 75% of hotels have reported weaker than expected bookings. Hotel rates in some cities remain above $300 per night, a price point well beyond the budget of many international fans who might otherwise have made the trip. Prices have dropped around 20% in recent weeks, but for many fans, that adjustment came too late to change their plans. All of this is real, and it's documented. There's no point ignoring it or minimizing it. though there's equally no point in amplifying it beyond what the evidence supports. Soccer has a way of generating its own energy once the matches begin, and it's entirely possible that some of the more pessimistic projections end up being too pessimistic. Last-minute bookings during knockout rounds could change the picture significantly, but there's a structural issue on the American side of this tournament that doesn't disappear just because the first whistle blows, and it has to do with something deeper than hotel prices or visa complexity. It has to do with the relationship between soccer and the average American sports fan. It's not that soccer isn't growing in the United States. It clearly is. The MLS has more support today than it did 10 years ago. American players are competing at the highest levels of European football. The U.S. men's national team has real talent, real investment, and real expectations for this tournament. But the typical American soccer follower is still, for the most part, someone who watches with a certain distance. Without the emotional bond of someone for whom this is the first thing they check in the morning and the last thought before sleep. And organizing a World Cup by assuming that bond exists, or that it can be generated artificially through institutional marketing and billion-dollar venues, is confusing the container with the content. The American host venues are architecturally impressive and logistically sophisticated. The problem isn't what they offer inside the stadium. The problem is what happens outside, in the hours before kickoff, in the bars nearby, in the streets. The atmosphere of a World Cup isn't built inside the arena. It's built in the entire city. Every block, every bar with the game on, every conversation in line at the food truck, every stranger turning to another stranger after a goal goes in. For that to happen, you need a city that has collectively decided this event genuinely matters. Not because someone told them it should, but because they already feel it in some deep way. That's a hard thing to manufacture on a 4-year timeline. The contrast with what's happening in Mexico and Canada is too clear to sidestep. There's a question that emerges from all of this, and I think it's worth asking plainly. What actually makes a World Cup work? Is it infrastructure, stadium capacity, the scale of investment? The data from 2026 suggests that none of those things are sufficient on their own. What seems to work is a specific combination: real, practical accessibility for the international fan, a local culture that absorbs the event organically instead of building it from the outside in, and an emotional connection to soccer that predates the tournament announcement by decades. Mexico has all of that in abundance. Canada is building it in a way that feels genuine and, honestly, more impressive the closer you look at it. And the gap between both of those countries and several of the American host cities says something important about what happens when FIFA prioritizes the largest market over the most passionate one, and then discovers, too late, that size and fervor are not interchangeable. There's something I think it's important not to lose sight of, after everything we've looked at here. On June 11th, when Mexico steps onto the field at the Azteca, and 83,000 people who have been waiting 40 years for exactly this moment react together, it won't just be a soccer match happening. It will be something without a precise name. The kind of thing that stays with you forever, even if you're not in the stadium. Even if you're watching from your couch 5,000 miles away, with the volume turned all the way up. That sound, that image, that instant when an entire country releases everything it has been holding in for decades. That can't be programmed. It can't be designed in a conference room in Zurich. Either it happens because the conditions for it have been building for 60 years, or it doesn't happen at all. And at the Azteca on June 11th, it's going to happen. The question I'm left with is an uncomfortable one, and I think it's worth asking out loud. Is anything going to change after this? Is FIFA going to look at the data from 2026, the stark contrast between what worked and what didn't, and make different decisions for future tournaments? Or are we going to be back here in 8 years, looking at another wealthy country, another massive stadium, another promise of the definitive spectacle, and the same underlying problems still waiting to be resolved? Because the problem isn't logistical, it's philosophical. It's the difference between understanding soccer as a market to exploit and understanding it as a culture to protect. And until that distinction genuinely enters the room where these decisions get made, until the people signing the contracts actually wrestle with it, this kind of conversation is going to keep being necessary